I'm Shane. This is the the second, I'm flustered after that, the second session in the Global Views of COVID-19 webinar series. This one is Lessons from the 1918 Flu Pandemic in India and Indonesia. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Arias. That's my organization, my office. After my brief intro and a little poll, a presentation from Siddharth Chandra, who is on right now. Then after he's done his presentation, there's going to be a Q&A. There's one of my colleagues, Sarah Maxim, is also on. She's going to be copying and pasting your questions into a document to ask Siddharth later. And then we'll have a little closing poll. I would really appreciate if you stayed for that. And then I'll share with you some other resources that are available. So I would like to introduce you to the speaker for today, who's going to talk for about 30 minutes. Professor Siddharth Chandra's research you can read. Interests include the 1918 influenza pandemic with a focus on Asia and the USA, behavior and policy relating to addictive substances, and the intersection of economics, health, and history in Asia, and applications of portfolio theory to fields outside finance for which the theory was originally developed. I'm going to leave you to read the remainder of that, and I just want to tell you that I reached out to him because I was inspired by an assignment where a number of teachers were trying to do comparisons between the 1918 pandemic and the current situation. And I know that there's plenty of information out there related to Western Europe and the US in regard to that, but if you're doing that, since that was a global pandemic, I was hoping that he might be able to help provide some broader information. I just realized that I didn't introduce myself at all, or my office. I'm sorry, Siddharth, I'm going to take a moment. So I'm Shane. I'm the program coordinator for Arias. Arias is at UC Berkeley. It is an office that does K-12 outreach on behalf of the 8 area studies centers that get Title VI funding at UC Berkeley. So I do K-12 programs for that. All right. And this is, I'm doing this in that capacity. Okay, so Siddharth, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kick it over to you, and you can share yours, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Shane, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Sarah Maxim, I think, who's somewhere in the audience, but I don't think all the names are fitting on one screen. And thank you, everybody, for coming out on this evening. I'm sure you have many other things you can do with your time. They're probably a little bit curtailed compared to what they used to be. But thank you very much for being in the room. I teach at Michigan State University. I'm an economist, actually, by training. But for the past a little bit over a decade, I've gotten very interested in pandemics, largely because of my interest in history. And also the fact that I noticed that the 1918 influenza pandemic, which was an event of enormous significance, had hardly been studied in the context of Asia. And as I hope this presentation makes clear, that's really the area on which I focus. So I'm going to pop up my PowerPoint presentation and share the screen with you, and we'll get started. So the topic of my presentation is Lessons from the 1918 Flu Pandemic in India and Indonesia. I'm actually going to pull in from experiences in other countries as well. If time permits, I'll talk a little bit about what happened in Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon. It was also a British colony. And then something a little bit closer to home, I'll look at the United States, and in particular, the state of Michigan, which is where my university, Michigan State University, is located. So, let's see. What are some of the basic things we can say about the 1918 influenza pandemic? Well, some very prominent epidemiologists have actually called this pandemic the mother of all pandemics. And it's been labeled that way by epidemiologists for 2 reasons. One is the virus that causes pandemic still circulates among human populations, variants of it. But also in terms of the toll it took, it's been ranked as one of the top 3 pandemics of all time. The others being 2 cases of the bubonic plague. This was a global pandemic, and depending on what part of the world you were in, it affected you in 1, 2, 3, or even 4 separate waves, and that's going to have some relevance to our conversation today. The approximate global death toll was 50 million, which is a staggering figure by any measure. And in India alone, the loss in population exceeded 15 million. And in Java, according to my calculations, the population loss exceeded 4 million. The death toll in the United States itself was a staggering 675,000. And if you look at data, demographic and health types of data from around the world, there is evidence of this pandemic in data across the globe. So it's been called the mother of all pandemics. It's also been, or at least had been until perhaps a few months ago, called the forgotten pandemic by many people. And the reason is it basically passed out of the consciousness of, I think, the world by the time the Second World War came around. Now, as Shane mentioned, the United States and Western European countries, their experience with the pandemic has been relatively well studied. But one of the things I noticed about 10 years ago was very little was known about what happened in South and Southeast Asia, which are two regions in which I have an interest. So the three topics for today, because I know we have to keep this a little bit short to allow for quick Q&A. The three topics I'm going to cover are very quickly: how did the pandemic spread? How did the pandemic evolve as it spread? And why was the pandemic so severe in India and Indonesia? And this is a question that has puzzled epidemiologists. So before I start, I want to introduce to you a basic epidemiology, a concept from epidemiology. And that is something called the basic reproduction number. Some of you may have heard of this concept. And basically what it means is, what is the average number of cases that a single case of infection produces during its infectious phase in a susceptible population? Okay. So if we think about the COVID-19, the coronavirus, the SARS-2 coronavirus that is currently entered the global population, and let's say it's a novel virus, it's something to which very few people had immunity when the virus first emerged. Let's say somebody catches the infection. What the basic reproduction number would be is the number of people to whom that person successfully transmits the infection. Okay. And if this reproduction number is greater than 1, it means that the infection is going to take off exponentially through the population. So let's say the reproduction number is 2. It means if I'm the first infected person, I'm going to infect 2 people. Each of those 2 people is going to infect 2, which makes it 4. And then you have 8, and then you have 16, and then you have 32. And if you draw a graph of that, you're going to see a curve that shoots up exponentially, right? And on the flip side, if the reproduction number is less than 1, then the epidemic will dissipate rapidly. Okay. For the 1918 influenza, the reproduction number is estimated to have been between 1.5 and 5.4, and this number can vary across populations for a variety of reasons. And just for comparison, if you look at measles, it has a reproduction number of between 12 and 18. It's an incredibly contagious disease. And even HIV/AIDS is 2 to 5, which is quite contagious. Okay. So to the first topic, how did the 1918 influenza pandemic spread? Did it enter Asia through particular locations? Did it follow particular transportation routes? Was some areas spared the devastation of the pandemic? And what are some of the factors that are associated with the spread pattern? Okay. And I'm going to explain this through 3 sets of maps, perhaps 2 if we're running short of time. The first one is a set of maps of India. Okay. Now, what we're talking about here is British India. So this is a colony, and it's a colony that comprises the modern nation states of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. Okay. Bangladesh, let me see if I can get this pointer to start working. So let's make it a red pointer. So Bangladesh is around here, Pakistan is here, and then modern day India is here, right? Now, one of the things you'll notice is the 4 maps that I'm showing you are the maps from the week of end September, September 29, then October 13, then November 10, and then December 8, approximately 1-month intervals, 3 to 4 week intervals. And what you'll see is when you see a district that's colored, what it means is the district is either close to or at its peak in terms of mortality, in terms of deaths. So the pandemic is really cresting in that district. If you see a dark brown, it's the worst week for deaths. If you see the bright red, it's the second worst. If you see the orange, it's the third. And if you see the yellow, it's the fourth. These are the peak weeks. And the first thing you should notice is that the pandemic actually enters India around Mumbai, what was called Bombay then, the big city of Bombay on the western coast. And for those of you who may have heard or learned a little bit about the history of the pandemic, we have the First World War being fought off in Europe to the west. And India is, of course, a British colony at the time and sends troops over to fight the war. This is a time when troops are beginning to demobilize. It's coming to the end of the war. And they come back to India on troop ships. And so the infection enters India on the west coast of India through Bombay. Okay. What's very interesting is we see this other little place on the eastern side of India. It's not near Calcutta, what's now known as Kolkata, which is a big city in Bengal. It's actually to the west of that. This, it turns out, is a major pilgrimage site in India. It's a place called Puri. It's one of the 4 places to which a lot of Hindus go at least once in their lifetime. And it seems like the pilgrimage spot was a very important place for the spread of the pandemic. Okay. A few weeks later, we're seeing it peaking in Western India. It's now taken hold in southeastern India. This is around another port, a garrison port, Madras. The garrison was known as Fort George at the time. So it seems to have entered either on a separate ship or perhaps from Bombay overland by the railway or by ship. And it's beginning to peak here. And then you can see a few weeks later, about a month later, it's begun to move to the north and to the east. And then finally, it's exiting India in December up on the northeastern side of the colony. Okay. So this is a pattern of spread that we see. We found in separate research that was published in an epidemiology journal that the virus actually traveled along a very well-developed railway infrastructure in India. You can actually see correlations between where the railway lines are and where the infections are flaring up. And this is a story you're going to see repeatedly, both with the 1918 pandemic and if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic that's going on today. Okay. This is a similar map. This is for Java in Indonesia, the most populated island in Java, in Indonesia. And of course, in the early stages, you see, let me make this a little larger, this pointer. Let's use a highlighter and let me just make it nice bright red. Okay. And if you look at where the pandemic is peaking early in Java, it's this little red dot over here. And you probably know, if you know the geography of Indonesia, that's the capital city, then known as Batavia, now Jakarta. Okay. The other place where it's peaking is around a city called Semarang on the northern coast. And these are both major garrison towns, perhaps not surprisingly. You have ships coming in, they have soldiers, they have other people coming from Europe, and the virus comes along with them. Okay. If you fast forward to about 3 weeks later, the pandemic has matured in the environs of Jakarta. So Jakarta has already gotten over its pandemic, but now the neighboring districts are infected. Bandung, which is another major city in West Java, is infected. Semarang seems to have seen the worst of it. And now Surabaya, another major city in Indonesia, in Java, is infected. Okay. And then it seems to have spread out from these big coastal cities into the interior of Java. And by early December, you see the central part of Java is being infected. And then the slightly more remote eastern portion, the so-called East Hook or the Ost Hook of Java, and then some of the southwestern districts. All right. So this is the pattern of spread in Indonesia. Again, it seems to have entered by ship and then proceeded through land routes to the rest of the island. Okay. I'm going to skip Sri Lanka. I'll come back to it if time permits later. So, so that's about patterns of spread. It comes by sea and it spreads by land. And it seems to have spread quite uniformly across Java and across India, almost like a wave. By the way, those Sri Lanka maps show a slightly different pattern, but I said, if we have time, I'll come back to it. So let's move on to a second phenomenon. Did the pandemic evolve as it spread? And this is a very interesting question for epidemiologists. So did it evolve as it spread? How did it evolve if it did? And what can we say about a concept called epidemic velocity, which is the speed at which this wave washes across the country, the duration of the pandemic wave. So how long does it last in any district once it sets in? And then how severe is it? So how high is the peak of excess mortality? Or how many deaths do we see above what we would normally expect to see at that time of the year in that location? Okay. And then finally, the third question, why did the pandemic evolve as it spread? Was this because of behavioral and social responses, or could it have been something else? And one very intriguing story I'm going to talk a little bit about is a theory of viral evolution. Okay, so first about the evolution of the wave, and this seems to be a little bit cut off, but that's okay. I can tell you what these are. So what we are seeing is the pandemic, when you look at what happened in British India, in 1918, India experienced what is known as a herald wave. So this is a wave in which deaths actually doubled or even tripled in these three major cities, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, right? And people started panicking. But then the wave subsided and everybody said, okay, we're done with that, hooray. But of course, you and I can see what's coming in October, and they had no idea what was coming their way that autumn. And sure enough, we got this huge wave of mortality in Bombay. So this is on the western coast. We had a slightly lower and slightly more spread out wave in Madras, which was on, if you remember, on the southeastern coast. And then by the time the wave got to Calcutta, you're looking at a very spread out. It looks mild, but remember it's not, because Calcutta is coming off 20, a death rate of about 20 in the middle of the year, and it's gone all the way up to 60. Okay, so this was actually a really nasty wave even when it hit Calcutta. It's just that it was completely dwarfed by what happened in Bombay and Madras. Okay, the important point here is the peaks of these waves show you how the disease is propagating across India. We start in the west with Bombay, then we go to Madras, that's to the south and the east, and then finally we head all the way over to the eastern side of India, Calcutta. Okay. The other interesting thing is the peak is, if you look at Bombay's peak, it's much shorter in terms of weeks. Okay, if you look at how wide this wave is at the bottom, it's much shorter than the wave is in Calcutta, which goes on for quite a long time, but it's a lot milder in its appearance, right? And that's another very interesting question. Clearly, something is happening to this wave as it moves across the country. So there are interesting questions about that. What we did with our statistical data, so the graph that you see in this slide was actually published by the Sanitary Commissioner of India, who was the top public health official in his report of 1918. And we actually looked at statistical data on monthly deaths for all the districts of India that we could get data for. And I've just picked out two of them for you. The red line is the district of Thana, which is a suburb of Bombay now. So it's on the west coast. It's where the wave first enters India. And I deliberately chose not to look at Bombay because we already had the graph for Bombay. I said, is this a pattern in the general neighborhood? And the answer was yes. And here's Thana, for example. And the yellow wave is the wave for Hooghly, which is a district right next to Calcutta on the eastern side of India, which, if you remember from this previous graph, had a very mild, well, what looked like a mild one relative to what happened elsewhere, but a much longer drawn out and a much lower, less of a sharp wave. Okay, so we see that pattern in the neighborhood of these areas as well. It's a systematic phenomenon. Okay, so there's a big question about why this may have happened, and there are at least a couple of reasons. So one is, in those days, communication was not that good. This was 1918. People didn't have, obviously, the internet, not even, telephones and so on. And so what probably happened is when the influenza came to India, it caught the public and it caught the government more or less unawares. And so what happened is the epidemic took off very rapidly in the first few districts that it entered, giving authorities very little time to deal with it. But once the pandemic came to India, word started spreading across the country, so that by the time the pandemic entered Calcutta, right on the other end of the country, word had already gotten around and people were already beginning to say, you know what, we better watch out. If somebody's ill, we better stay away, stay clean, take those the kinds of measures that should be all too familiar today. Okay, so one answer about why these waves are different is social distancing, the ability to prepare, behavioral changes. But there's another very intriguing story, and that is a story of viral evolution. So the virus is basically like a parasite. It needs to be in a human body in order to reproduce and then ultimately spread to the next person. You've probably read in the news that the coronavirus that's currently circulating does not survive outside the human body indefinitely, right? It survives for about a day on cardboard and maybe 3 days on copper. You've probably seen some of these articles in the news. Well, the same applies to influenza viruses. They're not viable outside the human body for very long, or another animal body for a very long time. And so now try to put yourself in the shoes of a virus, if there is such a thing. If you're a virus and you're trying to propagate, right? If you are really virulent and you kill your host very soon after you infect the host, that's going to reduce your chances of propagating, right? Now, another thing that happens with viruses, when they're in the body, they reproduce very rapidly, and multiple generations are born within a single host, allowing for a little bit of genetic shift as the virus reproduces, okay? So if you put these two facts together and you think about a virus that's circulating in a population, what kind of virus do you expect might become the dominant strain or the dominant strains? And what strains of viruses do you think might drop out of the gene pool, if you will? And the answer is, this theory of viral evolution suggests that virulent variants of a virus are less likely to propagate and survive in a population than less virulent variants. So these waves, remember, the red wave is the early wave. It's a really virulent wave. It's happening on the West Coast. The yellow wave is a much milder, it's still virulent, but it's much milder and it's much more long drawn out. These patterns are also consistent with viral evolution, okay? So it could be behavioral evolution, it could be viral evolution, and it could be something else. Let's move on. I'm going to bring things a lot closer to home now. So this is the pandemic as it manifested in Michigan, and these graphs have not yet been published. So we're actually writing papers on this subject right now. But one of the very interesting things you see in the state of Michigan is you actually see 4 different waves of this pandemic, right? You see the same kind of herald wave that we saw in India. Then you see this nasty fall wave, right, of 1918. But then you see another bump in December, which is very interesting. And then later on in 1920, in early 1920, you see another massive wave, okay? And by the way, the patterns of mortality in this wave of 1920 suggest that it was the same virus that infected populations in Michigan in 1918 as well. Okay, so what's going on here? This is a really interesting phenomenon and very relevant to what's happening today. If you take a look at these graphs below, if you look at the lower left-hand graph, right, what I did is I picked 4 counties in Michigan that are heavily populated. One is Wayne County, where Detroit is located, and which, by the way, today is a hotspot for COVID-19. Another county is Washtenaw County, where Ann Arbor, the site of the University of Michigan, is located. It has a large population, and it's right next to Detroit, okay? The third county is Ingham County, where I am right now, the location of Michigan State University, and we are located in the center of the state, okay? So Detroit and Ann Arbor are out in the east. Lansing, Michigan is in the center. And then the 4th location that we looked at is Grand Rapids, Kent County, which is the site of the 2nd largest city in Michigan. And it's located out on the western end of the state, okay? So I've picked 4 counties that show you regional variation. And here we see a very interesting pattern. So let me first show you the waves for the fall of 1918 for Detroit and Ann Arbor. And those are these 2 waves. Okay, and what you should notice is they peak in October, and then they taper off and they stay low in December, right? So this is on the eastern side of the state. When you come to the central part of the state, there's this kind of chestnut brown wave, which has 2 almost identical bumps. That's us, Lansing, Michigan. So we got it twice, all right? And by the time you get out to the west of the state, we're looking at Grand Rapids, Kent County. They had very little going on in October. They got hit in December, okay? So this double bump that you see here is actually the result of adding up what's happening across all the counties of Michigan. And for some counties, the double bump is a true reflection of what happened, like it is for Ingham. But for some, it's one or the other, all right? And this raises a very interesting question. Why did these counties experience such different effects? And it turns out the story has to do with the government policy. So the governor of Michigan, when he noticed what was happening in Ann Arbor and Detroit, which were among the early counties to be hit, the early cities, he said, we got to do something about this. And on about the 17th of October, he imposed a ban on the running of amusement parks and a lot of other places for public gathering. Okay, this should sound familiar to a lot of you. You're probably living under these kinds of restrictions right now. And then 3 weeks later, when he saw that things were getting better in those cities, around the 6th of November, he lifted the ban. Okay, so between these two lines, you see a ban, and then after that, the ban's been lifted. All right. Now, what had happened is by the time the ban was imposed, Detroit and Ann Arbor had already seen the worst of the pandemic. And people who had to be infected probably had gotten infected at the time, and they were beginning to taper off. Okay. But in the case of Lansing, Michigan, we were still just in the takeoff phase. And so when the ban was imposed, there were a lot of people who had not yet been infected who were what epidemiologists would call part of the susceptible pool. All right. And so they were still hanging around and they had no immunity to the disease. So when the ban was lifted, what happened? They started getting infected. Okay. And then finally, Kent County on the western side of the state had hardly begun to see the pandemic when the ban on movement was imposed. And so a very large fraction of the population remained unexposed and therefore not immune to the virus. And so when the ban was lifted, Kent County took off and they had a huge wave in December. Okay, so that's what explains the pattern. In early 1920, that didn't happen. And so everybody got their wave at the same time. And so that's one of the very interesting contrasts between what happens before and after. Okay, 1918 and 1920. Okay, and then finally, because I think we're coming close to the end of the presentation time. Why was the pandemic so severe in India and Indonesia? Okay, and this is a mystery. Sorry,
just to let you know, you've got like 7 minutes or so you're not too pressed.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I should be able to wrap up in 7 minutes. Thank you, Shane. So this is a mystery. You know, we know that influenza viruses are known to thrive in cool temperatures. So people have done research on these viruses in the lab, and they found that about 40 degrees Fahrenheit and dry conditions are the best conditions for the survival and the propagation of this virus, okay, across humans. But as you probably know, India and Indonesia have much warmer climates than that. And especially in October and in, June, July, May, June, when these waves hit India and Indonesia, it was really warm out there and in some cases very humid too. Okay. So it's always been a bit of a mystery, how come these viruses take hold in countries like India and Indonesia when they really shouldn't be surviving there, right? Now, the other interesting point is we see seasonal influenza in the United States every year, right? And why does it happen in the cold season? Partly because the conditions are ideal for the propagation of this virus, right? Of this family of viruses. We don't see this kind of phenomenon, by the way, in India and Indonesia. You don't have the kind of seasonal flu that you have in the United States, okay? So why was the pandemic so severe? And when I started looking at the reports of health officers, two things were really striking. The first was nutrition. Okay, so it turns out, the people of colonial India and colonial Indonesia, there were very large populations that lived in dire poverty, were very badly nourished. India had seen a series of famines 2 or 3 decades prior that had killed literally millions of people. And so there were sections of India, which, by the way, kind of correlate with where we see high mortality in 1918, that had experienced very severe famine. So central India, for example, right? So that was one reason repeatedly noticed by the sanitary officers in India. And the other one that's very intriguing from an epidemiologic standpoint is population density. So remember, the virus needs a host to survive, right? And if the climate conditions are really bad, it had better hurry up and jump to the next host or it's not going to survive, right? So it turns out where populations are dense enough, even if the climatic conditions are not favorable, you can still see if large enough numbers of people are susceptible. And remember, this was a novel virus, so everybody was susceptible, just like we are to the virus that causes COVID-19, right? The opportunities for jumping and propagating are very large. And so population density played an important role. We found in some of our research that the more densely populated districts of India suffered significantly larger losses in population in percentage terms than the less densely populated districts. So that's I think another important insight. And then finally, I'm going to end with what I've extracted from a report that was written by a health officer in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. He was actually in Java, on the island of Java. And this is what he says in his report. Moreover, with a few exceptions, it appears that the outbreak starts close to the large markets, what they call pasars in Bahasa Indonesia, the language of Indonesia, and develops around them. This is very important. Everyone knows the markets, which thousands of natives visit twice a week, swarming closely together. There could be no better opportunity to allow the infection to spread quickly and effectively. Okay, so that's my translation. I think it's relatively accurate. It comes out of a report that this health officer from the Regency in Indonesia, the equivalent of a county more or less is a regency, also called a kabupaten. He was in charge of the health in the Mogollon kabupaten. And then I pulled this out of his report too. His report is in Dutch and it's in words. And I thought since we might have a bit of a language barrier, I'd convert it into something perhaps a little more communicable. So I've actually created a map to show you sort of a blow-by-blow account of his account of how the disease is spreading across his regency, Mogollon. Okay, so this is the regency of Mogollon, and I'm now going to page through it and you can see what's happening. Now keep in mind, there are two main roads that come together and intersect at Mogollon. One is the road from a very large city in central Java called Yogyakarta. Some of you may be familiar with it. And this road comes north through what is now a big town, Muntilan, to Mogollon. And then it goes up north and veers off to the right and ends up going to another very large city on the northern coast of Java, Semarang. Okay, so this is a major highway. And the other important road is one that comes from another large city called Purworejo, comes up north, and then you can continue on to Semarang if you want, or if you want to be a little more adventurous, you want to check out a neighboring volcano, you can take a left and go to the road to Temanggung, which is another town. Okay, so now watch what happens. And what I'm going to show you is the little circles are his observation or his notation of when the first cases were observed in different parts of his regency. And then the big circles are when he says, you know, this place may have had cases before, now it's a center, and the epidemic is propagating out of it. Okay, so I'm going to go through this week by week, and you'll see how these things spread, and you'll see the importance of transportation. Okay, so the first sets of cases you see in Muntilan and Mogollon, and guess what? They're coming up the road from Yogyakarta. All right, because what's happening at the time is the city of Yogyakarta has been hit really hard by the pandemic. And he reports that there are people coming north to the pasars, to the markets, searching for food. All right. And these are locations of major markets in the region. Let's forward to another week. Okay. And now there are these all have markets near them. They are sort of a little bit off the road, not very far. This is the scale, 3 miles. So call it about 5 to 8 kilometers perhaps from the main road. And they've begun to see infections. And now these two initial spots have become centers for propagation. They are hubs of propagation, and the pandemic has spread either down or up. We don't know exactly whether it came up the road or down to the road to Purworejo. Okay. Next, it started spreading out from Mogollon into neighboring towns. And finally, it hits the more remote hilly areas in Java. Sawangan becomes a center for the spread into the most remote villages, which in this case are Ngablak and Pakis. Okay. And by the way, this year is a volcano. So one of the really neat things about Java is it's got many, many volcanoes. And so these topographical maps are always a lot of fun to draw and look at because you have these really interesting little conical formations peeking out at you. Okay. So finally, some lessons from the 1918 influenza pandemic. The first lesson, which I think we're all too familiar with, is viral pandemics can be devastating. Public awareness of these pandemics and their dangers, I don't think I need to make that point. It's very important to be aware. They have the potential to cause a huge loss of life. And Asia in particular, with its large, dense populations, is, I think, singularly vulnerable. Second, understanding the patterns of spread is very important. The role of large ports of entry, very important. When the COVID-19 pandemic first hit the United States, the government designated certain airports as being entry areas, designated entry areas. They restricted entry into the country. Guess what? A number of those are now hotspots for the pandemic. Okay, so the large ports of entry, understanding their role is very important, as is their interconnectedness with other locations. You've seen it in the context of a district in Java. You've seen it in the context of how it spreads across India. Okay. Lesson 3, pandemics can and do evolve as they progress. And there are many factors that play into this evolution, behavioral, biological, social, and policy factors. I think all of which I've touched on during this presentation. And really, we need to think about different strategies for different stages, right? If we go back to that diagram of the different waves in India, right? How you would respond to a short and really sharp wave like this, which is likely to overwhelm your healthcare system much more strongly, certainly, than a wave like this, it's going to be very different, right? The way you're going to handle one wave versus the other, one type of wave versus the other. And so understanding where you are and what it's going to look like is very important, I think, to getting a grasp on how you're going to manage the pandemic as it moves through where you are. And then finally, as we see in the cases of India and Indonesia, where the virus shouldn't really have done that well, given the climatic conditions, nutrition and population density are very important factors. They played a very important role in the really devastating effects of the pandemic in India and Indonesia. And then finally, this is part of a larger project. These are some publications that our group has produced, graduate students, faculty colleagues that we've co-authored as part of this project. Most of them look at Asia. A couple of them look at the United States. We did do a paper on the impacts on pregnancy, pregnant women, and childbirth, but I don't think I have time to cover that in this presentation. So thank you very much for listening. Be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to start with a really complicated one that's less epidemiology, well, sort of. And this one, Siddharth, is how did the pandemic figure into anti-colonial struggles in the South, particularly Indonesia and India? So the person notes, this was the year after the Russian Revolution of 1917, and it's followed by this period of anti-colonial movements. Could you comment on how the pandemic might have shaped anti-colonial movements, their demands, the rising resistance, and maybe meetings or mobility? Like, is there an interaction between the two?
Right. So this was, thank you very much. That's a great historical question. You know, this was the age of nationalism. This is the early 20th century. You have increasingly educated elites in a number of the Asian colonies of European powers. And nationalism is sort of coming into its own. 1918 was the year, for example, that Sarekat Islam, which was one of the proto-nationalist movements in Indonesia, really came into its own. And we see a number of similar developments in India. What I would recommend is, because I'm not an expert on the subject, there's a book by Laura Spinney, and the title starts with the words Pale Rider. So she's talked a little bit about it. She recently gave an interview with the Indian Express newspaper. So the spelling of the name is Laura, Laura Spinney. And she talks about some of the interactions between the pandemic and what was happening in India more so than the Netherlands Indies. But I have no doubt, my sense from what she's found is that it played a role in actually stimulating the nationalist movements even further. One of the difficulties is disentangling the role of the pandemic from the role of the First World War in providing an impetus for these events. And I think that is a very important point. The reason that we call the 1918 pandemic the forgotten pandemic, I think, is at least in part because it was overshadowed by the First World War, even though more people died of the influenza, far more than did people in the First World War. So I think paying attention to the role of the pandemic in sort of, fueling nationalist movements is an understudied subject and really needs to be studied more. Does the First World War deserve all the credit it gets?
Thank you. That is a good point. Okay, the second one that I'm asking you is coming from Jordan. I'm sorry, I didn't credit Rianne was the first one. I hope I said your name right. The second question is on the evolution question. The more virulent virus that arrived in Bombay had presumably been reproducing in human hosts in Europe. So would the process from more virulent to less virulent strains have proceeded in a linear fashion, most virulent among the first human hosts and steadily so less afterward, or not?
That's a fantastic question. It's a puzzle. We know that genetic mutation is random, right? So I think within individual cases, virulence can go in any direction. And so, and really speaking, remember I said this pattern is consistent with viral evolution. It doesn't prove it by a long shot. So keep that in mind. But yeah, to answer your question, it doesn't move in a linear direction. Mutations can happen anywhere on the genome, and they can do anything, right? So you might come in with a more, your index case is what we call it, right? The first case in a population may come in with a more virulent variant and happen to spread it to one or two people, and then it goes off exponentially. And then in large numbers, you begin to see, just statistically, you begin to see the moderation.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I think there was another a question. So there were a couple of questions about resources, about lessons and so forth. One is someone asked if we could share the lessons slide again. Everyone who is on, I'm going to send you a follow-up email, and it'll include a link to most, but not quite all of the slide deck. And I'll also be posting the recording, but that won't happen immediately because it needs to be captioned. The second thing is someone asked, how can we access the study or research on childbirth and pregnancy?
So I can actually, you know what, should I put a link into the chat?
That would be very helpful, yeah.
All right, I'll pop it up right now.
Okay. I'll address a question that's for me from Shelby, who says, will teachers who attend this webinar receive a significant of participation for CEUs? Shelby, I am certainly happy to write something to that effect for you. I'll include a question about it in the email that I send out, because what different teachers need might be different. Most importantly, whether it needs to be on letterhead or not, but I'm definitely happy to write something for people who've participated. And then, sorry, I'm looking at the questions here.
I think there's a couple questions about Michigan's restrictions in the pandemic, in the flu pandemic, and how they lifted them and decided to lift them.
Yeah, and I actually, can I jump? Yeah, let's take that one, Siddharth, when you have a moment. And
sure.
then
I just posted the link to the paper on maternal mortality and birth outcomes during the 1918 pandemic.
Great. Okay. So there was one question here about what can we learn from the lessons of imposing and lifting the physical isolation. Was that the same one you just said, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, there are two questions about Michigan's lessons learned then versus now.
Exactly.
That's a great question. In fact, I'm teaching a class of doctors tomorrow, and that's the puzzle we're going to put in front of them, is we're going to show them these waves and say, what lessons can you learn? I think there are a couple of lessons, but I'm not going to make any recommendations. But let me just, so here's what happens, right? If you impose a ban too late in the day or very late in the day, your population has already experienced the worst of the pandemic, right? It doesn't experience a second bump. If you impose it too early in the day, your population hasn't yet experienced it. When you relax it, the virus is going to be sort of, get out among the population. You're going to experience a severe bump. If you impose it at somewhat of a middling time, you're going to be an Ingham County, Michigan, a Lansing, Michigan, which had these two beautifully symmetric bumps, right? They were basically the same size. Now let's think about the implications of that. One of the big issues that people were thinking about was flattening the curve. I don't know if you've heard this phrase, right? But you want to put these social distancing and other measures in place so that your wave doesn't spike so high so rapidly that you completely overwhelm the health system. Okay? Now let's put ourselves in the shoes of the governor, though I don't think he was thinking this way. It just so happens that you have this beautiful natural experiment sitting out in front of you. If you're the governor and you're given the opportunity to impose 1 3-week ban, and you are allowed to impose it whenever you want to on each county, when are you going to impose it so as to minimize the stress on your healthcare system? Well, what you want to do is flatten the curve. And you know, the best that you can do is you're not going to flatten it. You're either going to get one early bump, one late bump, both of which are big, or one double bump, which is kind of moderate. Which one are you going to choose? And my answer would be is if overwhelming the health system is my primary concern, I'm going to choose the Ingham County approach. I'm going to time it the way that they timed it for Ingham County. So you keep that peak low, right? So that really, there is a lesson. There is something to be said for timing it right, but there are all kinds of other ethical issues that are involved, right? That means you are deliberately letting it spread up to a point, and that's going to have victims too, which is why I said I'm not going to make recommendations, but I can tell you my observation is if you impose it at the right time, you can spread it out really well.
Thank you. That's helpful, especially considering what everyone is contemplating right now. I want to give us 2 more questions, and I'm going to read them both to you, and you can take them in whichever order you want, and then we'll close. So the first one is, can you compare the publicity that the pandemic got in Dutch Indonesia versus British India? It was called the Spanish flu because no belligerent wanted to admit the loss of life in their own country, and Spain was neutral. But can you talk about the publicity in those places? And then the second question, kind of related, is can you speak briefly on how education about the 1918 flu was disseminated to the public in India and Indonesia in terms of telling people how to change their behavior?
Right. So, if you start looking at what the authorities did in India and Indonesia in 1918, you'll see that things haven't changed a lot in the sense that, of course, technology is a lot better. We're getting information a lot more rapidly. Today, we can learn about what 12 countries did right and 35 countries did wrong at the click of a button. So the speed and the richness of feedback and information we can get today is much greater than it was then. But the basics, you look at publicity that was going around in the United States, you look at the kinds of publications that, for example, the Burgerlijke Geneeskundige Dienst, which was the civil medical service in the Netherlands East Indies, was producing, very familiar. I'll give you one example. In Java, the civil medical department, so Java has this long tradition, the wayang tradition. I don't know if you're familiar, but these are basically these stories that come from epics, some of which originated in India, some of which are very much local, where you have these heroes, so the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and then a variety of local stories as well. And all of these epics have wise people. And in the case of the major Javanese epics, the wise people are a group of 4 so-called clowns, the Puno Kawan. One of whom is this really plump person. His name is Samar. And he's really sort of the leader. He's kind of the father of these clowns. Though the other ones are kind of adoptees, at least one of them is. And he really is revered as almost as a god. I mean, he has as being extremely wise. Okay. And so what the Dutch East Indies authorities did is they actually did a publication in which these 4 Puno Kawan were talking to each other about how to deal with the influenza. And the tips were very familiar. It was, don't come too close to somebody who's sick. Keep the place well aired. Basically you don't want the infection to come in. There were a few things that obviously they weren't familiar with that they also put in, but they used local cultural traditions to try to get the word across to the public. And very similar measures were taken in India.
Thank you. That's great. And that sort of hits at both of those. Was there the sort of like belligerence about where it may have come from in the 1918 instance in those two places?
I don't recall reading anything to that effect. Um, but it's not inconceivable. And I think historians who study perhaps nationalist movements might know a little bit more about that, because I can see it as being used to kind of, point out some of the evils, if you will, of colonialism. We are interconnected, and look what came our way. So,
yeah.
But that's pure speculation. So.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And thank everyone for participating. And thank you, Siddharth, again, so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. It was really helpful. Oh, I'm sorry. There was one other question about COVID-19 that I missed, apparently.
Okay.
It was from Ken. Oh, it says, given your experience working with the data available from 1918, how would you anticipate exploring and analyzing the big data becoming available on COVID-19? Would it be able to map even smaller areas?
So I think that, we're in the 21st century, and this means we have far more data, far more sophisticated methods to analyze the data. We have data that is genetic in nature. We have zip code level data on how the pandemic is spreading. So, if you're into data and data analysis, this is going to be a real bonanza to study. I still think the 1918 pandemic will be of use and interest going out in the future, because this is the second pandemic of its kind, right? For which we have some kind of statistical data. And, the COVID-19, the virus that causes it, is a little bit different from the H1N1 influenza. But these are great times, if you are into analyzing data, these are great times, because my wife is a senior community epidemiologist here in our county, and the kinds of data that they have are just incredible. I wish they had these kinds of data for the 1918 pandemic.
Yeah.
So we're going to know a lot more about pandemics coming out of this one than we ever could have figured out just using the 1918 data.
All right, that's great. And weirdly ending on a weirdly positive note there.
Right.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.